Thank you all for joining us today for another webinar with AgriLogic. This one is over food safety. My name is Diego with Farmer Veteran Coalition. And I'm here with Brandon, Tom, and Kim, and this time we're being joined with Matthew Taylor with Texas A&M University. He'll be handling the presentations today, going over food safety and microbial hazards in foods, stuff like that. If you have any questions, put them in the chat and Q&A. We'll answer them halfway through the presentation as well as in the end if we have time. But Brandon, if you have any words to say, and then we'll hand it over to Matthew.
Yeah. Like Diego said, today's topic is food safety. This webinar is brought to you through a partnership with the USDA Risk Management Agency and with Farmer Veteran Coalition. With the increasing interest in farm to table these days, this is an especially relevant topic related to managing risk for those that produce meat and produce. We're fortunate to have a subject matter expert, Dr. Matthew Taylor, for today's webinar. He's a professor of food microbiology in the Department of Animal Science at Texas A&M University. In addition to his research and teaching responsibilities, he provides industry food training for those in Texas and beyond. He has a lot of information to cover today. And like Diego said, we'll try to get to some questions. So with that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Diego. Just thank you, everyone, for being willing to come and listen today. I appreciate that. And I hope I hope you find what I'm about to kind of cover for you informative. So let's jump right into it. I want to talk today about some of the microorganisms that are in your food, meat, dairy, and produce as three major types of foods that we consume on a regular basis. And some of those organisms in particular that can cause some, rather mild to very, very severe negative health outcomes or consequences. Talk about some of those pathogens. What are some of the factors that impact their growth? What are some of the things that we as food producers, food processors, and ultimately food consumers, what do we do? What can we do to protect ourselves against the growth of these microbes? Because many times it takes a certain minimum number of microbes to make people sick, to make your children, your parents, your grandparents, family, friends, coworkers, community members sick. And so what can we do to keep those numbers low enough to potentially stave off some of those illnesses? How do they get into our food? And then what can we do from a processing perspective in the home, but as well as you'll see, there's some opportunity to kind of see that scaled up into commercial food manufacture. The reason we're talking about this is, as I said, food safety is a really, really important thing. In the last 10 to 15 years, there have been massive changes in the U.S. foods industry with respect to new food regulations, new rules about how we handle things like fresh produce, dairy products, a host of further processed foods, meat and poultry even. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has, over the last 10 years, implemented some pretty revolutionary, or I might say transformative, new programs in the U.S. meat and poultry and egg products industries to further ensure food safety. And all of that is around primarily microbial pathogens. These are these bacterial organisms or fungal organisms or other kinds of microbes that if they get inside of us or they grow in our food product, they have the potential to cause us disease or illness or injury. And so in the food industry today, we kind of collectively refer to these microbes, these pathogens, as being human health hazards. And so if you go into food manufacturing or food production and you talk to regulatory agency employees like members of the Texas Department of Agriculture, for example, or a state agency or a federal agency, oftentimes they'll use the word hazard to kind of talk about some of these organisms. In the US today, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is the lead epidemiological organization or agency, as it were, that tracks the data on, well, how many cases of foodborne disease are occurring every year, and how many of those progress to very severe outcomes like hospitalization or fatality, and what are some of the microbes that are doing that? And so I've given you some data that are admittedly pretty old. They're about 13 years old, but they're still the best data we have. And if you look at that, I'm breaking these down by three major types of microbial hazards or microbial pathogens. The blue are viral pathogens, and we'll talk about some of these viruses that can cause human foodborne disease. We're all very well aware of COVID-19, influenza virus, cold virus, uh, AIDS, all these types of viral pathogens that can cause anywhere from moderate to very severe health loss and outcomes, negative outcomes. But there are also viruses that can do, pretty severe damage to us in terms of foodborne disease and gastrointestinal health. The red is for bacterial organisms. I'm sure many of you have heard of Salmonella or E. coli 0157H7. These bacterial organisms that can cause some pretty nasty outcomes. And then these last things, this little green is the parasites. There are a variety of parasitic organisms that you can consume in food. Most of them are not fatal, thankfully, but you do have a rather high case count or fatality count. So there's not a lot of them that will kill you. This is sounding really weird, but the ones that do it pretty well. I know I've just really kind of freaked everyone out. But when we think about foodborne disease in the US, there's not just the direct health outcomes that we have to contemplate in terms of managing and protecting public health. There's also a massive financial outcome, and it's never good. There's a massive financial cost of all this foodborne disease. Now, the USDA tracks these data and makes estimates of this. The latest data we have are from 2018, and you can see some of these numbers. But if you look at this, these are in billions, okay? These are not in millions, these are in billions. And if you sum all that up, roughly 16 to 17 billion dollars are lost annually, and that's in 2018. So we could try to adjust that up to, if it was 17 and a half in 2018, it's probably closer to like 18 and a half billion now with inflation. That's a lot of cost savings if we could get a handle on that. And again, the same color coding on the left, bacteria drive the most significant foodborne disease events. More people get hospitalized because of bacteria. More people die because of bacteria than they do viruses. And so if you can think about it, the more severe the case, the more likely you are to have to go seek medical attention, the more likely you are to get hospitalized or potentially succumb to it. Your costs just keep going up and up and up, as compared to a mild, just diarrheal illness, which you don't want. You stay home and lose some income from work, but you're not paying those other costs. In 2013, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, also estimated, if you look at the left-hand column, the types of foods, which are the types of foods that are really kind of driving these overall trends that we see in foodborne disease. And dairy products caused a fair number of illnesses, but meat products, red meat products in particular, really caused more illnesses than any other major type of food product, even fresh fruits and nuts. Now, fruits and nuts caused the largest fraction of total outbreaks of disease, but meat products, beef, pork, game meat, small ruminant meat like lamb's meat, goat's meat, collectively caused just under 1.5 million cases per year. And I say all this to say, one, to kind of get the party started, get us kind of rolling on this, but remind ourselves that, yeah, while these epidemiological terms can kind of be sometimes ignored because, well, it's just the numbers. It's, the numbers really do refer to people. And so if you've ever had a foodborne disease, or you think you've had a foodborne disease, or a child has, a parent, a coworker, what have you, all those numbers kind of fade away. And what you're left with is, hey, that's me. I'm the one who's losing work, or that's my child that I'm staying home from work to take care of. That's my loved one, my spouse, my significant other, my father, my mother, what have you, my brother, sister, whomever. And so I put this picture in. This is my family on a family vacation a couple years ago. That's my wife on the bottom left, and then my son and daughter. And it's kind of like anything else. The numbers get real abstract, and I really stop caring about the foodborne disease estimates when it's my daughter who I've got to take care of for 3 days because she's contracted something. So I want to talk some about the differing microorganisms that are really leading the way in U.S. foodborne disease, both at the large commercial scale as well as down at the sort of small scale that some of you might be involved in. But to do that, I want to talk about 3 major types, or 3 major terms that I'll use over and over again. Foodborne disease syndromes. Foodborne diseases are really kind of classified as either being an infection. And so if you've ever heard of Salmonella, Salmonella is an infectious agent because you have to eat the living salmonella in the food, the poultry, the cheese, the beef, the melon, like the cantaloupe or what have you. And it's salmonella growing in you, which causes damage to us. And intoxication is something different. I had a very nasty incident a long time ago with not a staphylococcal toxin, but a different microbial toxin where my family and I stopped at a fast food restaurant and I got a sandwich made. And the guy handling and making the sandwich and ringing me up did not practice good personal hygiene. I ate my sandwich, and about an hour and a half later, I was feeling really, really, something's not right. And thankfully, we made it to our hotel just in time for me to check in and run to the restroom before I had to, experience some symptoms of a toxin that was disrupting my stomach. And then the last one is this thing called a toxico infection. Excuse me. Many of you may have heard of E. coli 0157H7 and what it did many years ago in the hamburger chain Jack in the Box, or maybe more recently with Chipotle and other restaurant chains, where it caused very large multi-state outbreaks. Hundreds of people got sick. People died. In 2006 in California, 6 people died from E. coli 0157 cross-contamination of fresh spinach. One of those was a 4-year-old boy. And so in young consumers, this thing called a toxico infection, and E. coli 0157 is a type of example of organism that can do that, can lead to some really severe negative health consequences and outcomes. So these are the 3 major types of foodborne disease syndrome. All the bacteria and viruses I'm going to talk about fit into one of these 3. And the first one I'm going to talk about is this organism, Bacillus cereus. It's an organism that can cause either an intoxication or a toxico infection. It's really problematic in high starch foods, such as you see fried rice. In fact, in the US today, oftentimes cases of bacillus disease are labeled as Chinese rice syndrome. Because if you go to any kind of buffet restaurant, like a Chinese restaurant or a Golden Corral or something of that nature, and you go in those hours in between the lunch rush and the dinner rush, you never know how long that rice has been sitting there, maybe getting cooler and cooling off. And so this organism is really, really cooking tolerant. And so it can survive cooking. And so if it does that and then you cool it down, all of a sudden, boom, it kind of wakes up from its being asleep kind of mode, and then it starts eating on all that rice with all that starch and all that sugar that it has. It can eat protein, it can do a lot of things, but as it's growing, it's secreting these toxins into the food. You don't get sick from the bacterium, you get sick from the toxins it secretes in the food. This table tells us kind of how much it takes and where the toxin works. And so this is what I experienced back in that sort of sandwich event that I had. I had really severe nausea while I was driving. Thankfully, I didn't vomit until I finally parked the car, because that would have been really gross. But this is just about right. About an hour and a half after I ate, I knew things were not going to go well for the rest of my evening. And so I've suffered this, and it's not fun. But the only thing that's good about it is you get over it pretty quickly. Well, that's a great question in the Q&A, but I'm going to get to that question, but hold that question. That's a great one. Another organism that is in the US on occasion really severe, but typically we don't see a lot of this, is the organism Clostridium botulinum. And this organism causes a really severe intoxication type disease called botulism. I'm guessing many of you have heard of botulism. Botulism has struck members of the US military on foreign deployments. In the early 1990s, Operation, I forget the name of the operation, Desert Storm, US soldiers contracted, a small number of US soldiers contracted botulism from cross-contaminated food that was mishandled. In the US domestically, one of the most recent outbreaks occurred where in California, there were some convenience stores that would sort of hold nacho cheese for putting on chips, and they would hold it for a while and keep it warm, kind of like, you see the hot dogs and sausages on the rollers, that kind of thing. But people got very, very sick, and a few people actually did die. Botulinum toxin, it takes very, very little of it to make you sick, and it takes not a whole lot more to admittedly potentially kill you. It's a very, very potent agent. These are some of the disease symptoms. It doesn't really cause much in the way of most typical GI symptoms, but it's a neurotoxin. If you've ever been vaccinated, I'm sure many of you have, or all of you have, you've been vaccinated for tetanus or lockjaw. That's also caused by another type of Clostridium. And so this toxin happens to paralyze muscles, whereas the toxin from the organism that causes tetanus contracts the muscles and it locks them in. And so you see this teenage boy who is suffering botulism. The real thing about it is that you can see, okay, well, droopy eyelids, loss of motor control. Okay, that's not good. But look at this one. This is where we see a lot of deaths occurring. This toxin also interacts with your diaphragm, and that shuts down your ability to conduct inhalation and exhalation. In fact, you can inhale all day long, but you cannot exhale. And if we can't exchange inhalation, exhalation routinely, then we are going to suffer, or sorry, we're going to suffocate. And botulism actually kills most people simply by suffocation because it shuts down our body's ability to inhale and exhale. Much, much, much more common is this organism, Clostridium perfringens. It's really problematic in products like stews, beef or Salisbury beef tips with really heavy gravies and sauces that are cooked, but then might be transported to events like potlucks or church dinners or things like that. And if you don't keep it sufficiently hot, you let it cool down a little bit, this organism grows really, really rapidly. I mean, he is a lightning McQueen when it comes to replication rates. And the reason that's a problem is if you consume this organism in very high numbers in your GI tract, such as if you consume meatballs, if you look at this graphic on the right, if you consume meatballs and you have a large number of Clostridium perfringens organisms, well, some of those organisms are going to die in your stomach, but some of them are going to survive. And then they're going to get down here, and these organisms are going to go through a process called sporulation. And it's not really important to know what sporulation, how it works, but it's really important to kind of know what it does for you. And what it does is, as that organism goes through this process of sporulation, it releases this diarrhea-causing toxin in your lower intestine. And you know what the symptoms are. I love the term explosive diarrhea because you just have this massive loss of water holding in your gut, and you just can't take it, and you are constantly having to go to the bathroom to get relief for about a half a day to a day. It's a very uncomfortable disease syndrome. Thankfully, it's not often requiring hospitalization or fatality, but it's very common. In fact, the CDC has estimated it in the past to be maybe the bronze medalist, as it were, of bacterial foodborne disease. For those of you in Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama, and other parts around the state, you might recognize Listeria monocytogenes from a very large 2015 outbreak associated with Bluebell ice cream. This organism causes an infection. You have to eat it, and it has to survive stomach passage and get into your gut. It causes very, very few cases of foodborne disease in the US every single year. But it's very significant because it has anywhere from about a 1 in 4 to a 1 in 3 fatality rate. So very few cases, very high fatality count amongst those cases. It's also really problematic because even if you refrigerate your foods properly, like your hot dogs, bologna, luncheon meats, fresh produce, it can grow on those kinds of foods even under refrigeration conditions. And that makes it a continuing risk if we don't effectively wash our produce or fully cook our luncheon meats prior to consumption. Even though technically you shouldn't have to cook a bologna, I still think you should, just to, make it safer. There's an organism known as Campylobacter. This one causes a lot of disease. He causes an infection. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about Campylobacter is because, unlike some of these other pathogens, this one has the capacity to induce what are called chronic disease sequelae or chronic syndromes. So you can go through the sort of short-term, immediate diarrheal illness, But then it could actually come back and you could just kind of have to start to learn how to live with this for some amount of time. It also has the capacity to get into our circulatory system and cause really severe disease syndromes in other parts of our body other than just our gastrointestinal tract. And so if you look at these, meningitis, well, meningitis is a swelling of the meninges in the brain, pancreatitis, endocarditis, things that are, swelling or inflammation of sacs and other organs in the body that are not necessarily always directly a function of the gastrointestinal tract. Guillain-Barré syndrome is an autoimmune disorder. And what that means is that the organism actually tricks the body into attacking itself via your own immune system. And Guillain-Barré is sometimes typified by symptoms of paralysis of your limbs, of your digits. It could even result in sort of a constant tingling or tremor. In some ways, it's similar to Parkinson's disease in terms of the symptoms, how they appear. It's not the same thing, but it can appear the same. And all of this is being driven by this organism, which, again, can sort of hijack our body's immune system under certain cases and lead the body to effectively attack itself. It doesn't realize that's what it's doing, but that's still the outcome. Campylobacter oftentimes occurs through cross-contamination of fresh poultry products that are not properly cooked in the home, or maybe you do cook your fresh poultry properly, but if you use the same cutting board, cutting implements, or preparation tools in the kitchen, we see this oftentimes leading to cross-contamination of things like a salad. So imagine you're making a fully cooked chicken dish, and you prepare the chicken breast as you may see there on the picture, and then you use the same knife or cutting board, and you don't do a good job at washing and sanitizing those boards and knives. And also now you got Campylobacter on a salad that you're serving as a side item on your meal. Well, the salad's not going to get cooked, but yet there's chicken juice, which had this organism in it. If a child consumes Campylobacter, it doesn't take many cells to survive the stomach passage of the child in order to potentially get really severe disease. It's a very common type of foodborne disease. It's most of the time not going to be fatal, not going to require hospitalization, but on those very severe cases or events, like I showed you a moment ago, it can really do some serious lifelong damage, or at least long-term damage to you. Probably the organism that everyone's heard of at least once, and I hope you haven't experienced it. I have a few times doing what I do for a living, is that of Salmonella. Salmonella causes more cases of bacterial infection in the US via food every year than any other pathogen we have out there. And if you look at the bottom, like I said, there's been pretty much an outbreak or a recall of Salmonella contaminated foods across every major sector, and even a host of minor sectors across the food industry. When I teach my undergrads here at A&M, I admit, I kind of like to have a little fun with them. I ask them, it's like, so what are some of your comfort foods? What are the foods that just kind of take you back to home, take you back to your childhood? They make you feel good. You love eating them. You share them on a date with friends, whatever. And I pretty much just I start popping bubbles, as it were. Yeah, there's been a recall of that. There's been an outbreak there. There's been multiple outbreaks there. Salmonella is very pervasive across our food production and food processing, shall we say, chain or industry. And that's not to say that we cannot control it and we don't control it. We do, but it's still out there. It's very pervasively spread. And the food industry in the United States, as well as globally, every day goes to work thinking, what do I do to control Salmonella today? What did I do yesterday that worked? And I got to keep doing. What have I got to get better at so I can keep Salmonella away from my consumers? And again, a kind of a little bit more demonstration, all the different kinds of foods. The differing bars, their colors mean differing types of foods. These data are from 2008, but what they kind of show you is that so many different types of Salmonella and so many different kinds of foods. Some Salmonella are really good at contaminating some types of foods like shell eggs. Others are really good at poultry meat, red meat, dairy products, what have you. And I just show you that to show you that in the organism Salmonella, there is great variety. And there's also great variety in the food products that we have observed in the US and globally, it being transmitted to us by. It's an infection really severe symptoms, potentially can cause hospitalizations. Most cases don't result in that, but it's not a whole lot of fun to go through. I speak from experience there. And the last major pathogen I want to talk about is that of E. coli. You've probably heard of E. coli 0157H7. There are some other pathogenic Escherichia out there, but 0157H7 and these what are called enterohemorrhagic E. coli, these ones that cause very, very, very severe forms of diarrhea, that it's not just that it's uncomfortable, but you're actually shedding blood in your stools. And that, think about that. We're dehydrated and now we're having damage done that we're shedding blood. So it gets compounded just how bad this type of disease syndrome can be. STEC, E. coli pathogenic. E. coli typically hit us from animal-derived foods. Ground beef has been a food vehicle over and over and over again. But in more recent years, we've seen fresh produce that have been irrigated with feces-containing waters. For those of you who are interested in growing fresh produce and irrigating, one thing I would recommend is be very, very aware of what is the microbiological condition of the waters that you want to use to irrigate those crops or wash them in the post-harvest packing environment. This is what it can do to us. It takes a long time to figure out what you have. If you have it, are you sure you have it? And all the while, disease symptoms just keep getting worse and worse. There are viruses, like I said, they oftentimes cause diarrheal illnesses, but they don't typically cause fatalities. One interesting thing about viruses is viruses only grow inside of you. Doesn't take many viruses to get you sick, but they only grow inside of us. And then there's this last major group, these things called protozoans. These are collectively a type of parasite. They can, depending on which organism you're talking about, they can really mess with you. But most people do not die. Most people do not need to go to the hospital because of these types of diseases. But in those fractions of people who do contract disease, it can be pretty freaky, no doubt. All right. My clock says approximately 12:30. Did we want to take a quick break and answer some Q&A before we move into the next section?
That sounds great.
All right. I see one question in Q&A. It says, why do I always get sick when I travel to South America? What's different here? A big thing is the element of water. And it's not just drinking water, although we've all kind of heard the admonition, don't drink the water when you travel to South America. You have to think about, and this image actually kind of helps me answer that a little bit. You have to think about not only the water, because it might contain sewage that isn't properly treated, but then think about the water as it might be applied to soils where food, vegetables, crops might be grown or might be sowed in, or water that might be fed or given to ruminant animals or livestock animals. So yeah, you don't drink the water directly because certain South American countries don't have the water treatment capacities that we have in the United States, Europe, and other countries. But in addition to that, you got to think about those same sources of water might also be used to irrigate crops. And again, fecal matter, fecal pathogens get transmitted via water onto the crops. And so you have to be kind of careful. So when I travel overseas, depending on where I travel, I only drink bottled water, and I admittedly shy away from fresh fruits and vegetables on salads and those sorts of things, just because I don't know what kind of water treatment capacity you have. So I don't want to pick up anything that I could, potentially have to live with for quite a while. But that's a big part of what's driving that. Can these bacteria get into food oils? Yes, on certain conditions they can. They don't do well in food oils. These bacteria need water. So can they cross-contaminate food oils like olive oil or canola? Yes, they can. Will they survive effectively in the oil? No, they will not. They can't grow in the oil. They can't use it as a nutrition source very effectively. So contamination is possible. Replication really is not. Oh, I see in the chat. Let me go back. Oh, where'd my chat window go? Oh, the parasitical scientist's name. Yeah, Flegger. Yeah. Cool kind of guy. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? All right. So let's talk about where these organisms come from, or what I really mean by that is how do they make entry into our food, in our food producing environment, so that helps us kind of understand how they make their way into our foods. Well, in red meat and poultry meat yielding animals like cattle, pigs, goats, sheep, uh, uh, um, chickens, turkeys, ducks, etc., we encounter these pathogens in the animal's production environment. And that can occur both in pastured animals and free ranging animals, as well as in confined animals, fed animals. This occurs in fed beef, fed dairy, production barn operated poultry animals, what have you. They can make their way in primarily from the feces of other animals. And these can be wild animals that make their way into the same pasturing lands that the livestock are in, or from each other. This is particularly true in poultry. If you have a few chickens that are shedding salmonella in their feces, it won't take very long before most of the chickens in that poultry barn are probably also shedding feces or shedding salmonella in their feces. And so these are some of the sources on the animal that, as a food microbiologist, a food safety specialist, I deal with the animal once it's been slaughtered. But I got to think about, okay, that animal walked up into our harvest facility and we slaughtered it humanely. But now I got to think about, as I pull feathers, pelt, hide, skin, whatever, I eviscerate the animal. Where are all those sources of microbes that could cause my consumers harm? I'm trying to get meat. I'm trying to get edible components off. How do I get those off safely? The processing environment is a big, big way in which organisms might make entry, but it's also a very big way in which we prevent that and we try to control against that. One of the major mechanisms by which the US foods industry today prevents cross-contamination of what will become edible meat or edible produce or edible dairy products is through sanitation and sanitization of our establishment. This also plays out in the produce producing environment, the fruit and vegetable environment. This graphic comes to us from the Produce Safety Alliance and its grower training course. It shows you that if you think about it, we have sort of this ecology of food production. And if we look here, we have CAFOs, fed beef cattle or dairy cattle, produce a massive amount of manure. Well, what happens if we have events like excess rainfall, flash flooding, things like that? Well, we might have runoff that you see feeds into a water body source that might then get used to irrigate cropping lands. This has actually happened in the past in the United States, and it's led to very severe foodborne disease outbreaks. This also has happened not only from fed confined operations, but also from pastured or free ranging animals. This actually took place in 2006. Dairy cattle were pasturing nearby a spinach field, and it is assumed from the epidemiological investigation that fecal matter made their way into that field via cross-contamination of groundwaters that were used to irrigate those fields. So we can see that these sorts of things, animals, food cropping systems, that ecology of production, everything comes together, and there's always the opportunity for something to happen. In the post-harvest fresh produce packing environment, it's very similar to the meat and poultry environments. Sanitation of the facility, good personal hygiene of our workers, how we maintain a sanitary operation, all of that comes together or has to come together in order for us to really minimize the opportunity for cross-contamination. There are a variety of factors that can impact bacterial growth, and if we as food processors and producers can get a handle on them, we can really do a lot for ourselves. I want to show you this graphic to show you that bacterial organisms, they grow because they can grow outside the host. They can grow to very, very large numbers if we do not maintain control. And so as a food safety specialist, I want you to look at that bottom left-hand side, that lag phase. That phase of a bacterial population's growth is where I, as a food safety specialist, exert all my efforts to keep the bacteria in very, very small counts. Because if I can do that, I'm protecting against intoxications, and I will also protect against a lot of infections. So as a food safety specialist and as a food processor yourself, a food producer and processor yourself, your goal is always to do what you can to slow down the growth or stop the growth of microbes so that you can actually keep your risk of disease or your consumer's risk of disease as absolutely minimal as possible. These are some of the factors that actually affect that. I'm going to go through a few of them, not going to talk about all of them, but some of them probably look pretty familiar. pH and acidity. I show you this graph just to show you that some foodborne microorganisms, they can grow across in all kinds of foods. All of the things being equal, acid, alkaline doesn't really mess with them all that much. Many of our foodborne pathogens, if you can see my mouse moving, they grow in a much narrower range. And so foods like milk products, egg products, fresh meats, even some fermented meats and other types of fermented foods, the acid helps slow them down, but it doesn't always stop them. And so acid control, pH control, is one factor that as we can control it for the foods that, hey, fermentation or acid addition works for, great. That's going to slow them down. But what are some other things we can do? In certain foods, as we dehydrate the food, as we remove water, we change this thing called a water activity. That's this little AW looking guy, not AW the root beer, AW the water activity. Water activity tells us something about how water is available to microbes, how accessible it is. If you think about it, even though you and I could crunch on a cube of ice on our sweet tea or our soda one day, imagine that a bacterium has an option between liquid water that it can get to and use and frozen ice that it can't really use because bacteria don't make pickaxes, as it were. The liquid water that's right there, hey, I'm going for it. If it's, give me a choice between diving into a swimming pool that's a balmy 70 something odd degrees and diving into an ice bath that's a frigid 50 degrees, I'm going for balmy. Okay. And that's what this water activity really kind of talks to us about. It shows us that some organisms, such as Clostridium botulinum, such as others, really prefer a lot of useful, available water. And a lot of fresh foods have a lot of available water in them, like fresh meat, fresh milk, fresh produce. And so when you can dry foods, think about beef jerkies, turkey jerkies, trail mixes with dried almonds, dried fruits, those are shelf stable for long periods of time because you just pull all that water away that the microbes need. Probably the biggest one we all know about is temperature control. And that's why I show you the danger zone on the left. You've probably heard of the danger zone, that 40 to 140 Fahrenheit, where if you let food sit out in that danger zone too long, hey, you could have spoilage of the food. You could also have unsafe food. And the graph on the right is just sort of a way to kind of demonstrate that. If we hold foods at very cold temperatures like refrigeration or freezing, we can hold them for a long time, can't we? A lot of you may have frozen meats, frozen other kinds of food in your freezer at home, chest freezer, an upright freezer in your kitchen. And you can hold those so long as you keep them frozen for who knows how long time. You could keep refrigerated foods for far longer than you could on the shelf. But if you let them warm up too much, then we get into this sort of hazardous realm. And we don't want that. That's not good. Because if we warm it up too much, all of a sudden you've sort of put those microbes in a really good environment for them to grow, replicate. And remember, I want to keep bacteria in that lag phase. If I can keep them in the lag phase by keeping my food cold, then hey, I'm doing myself a lot of good and I'm doing my consumers a lot of good at protecting their safety by the food that I'm selling them or the food that I'm giving to them. So all of these are sort of a relate there. We kind of use this in the food safety industry. We use the acronym FAT-TOM. FAT-TOM is food, how nutritious it is. Some bacteria can eat certain foods really well and others they can't. Acidity, time and temperature, because when it comes to cooking of foods, chilling of foods, holding of foods, it's all about time and temperature. Some bacteria do really well in foods like vacuum packaged meats. Other microbes don't. And so how much oxygen do you give them also influences some organisms. And then lastly is moisture. How much water do they have? So remember FAT-TOM: food, acidity, time and temperature, oxygen, and moisture content or moisture availability. The last one I want to give you is this acronym called PERIL. PERIL stands for prevent contamination, eliminate organisms that are there, and if you can't eliminate them, at least reduce their numbers to an acceptable or a safe level. And in the food industry today, we have three major types of approaches to do that. And those are chemical preservatives, physical forms of processing, and facility sanitizing. Chemical preservatives, there's a lot of different types that are out there. Many of them are, used to halt the growth of microbes. Some of them will actually kill microbes, but a lot of them are used to reduce their numbers and then hold them there at acceptable levels or counts. The organic acids, if you've ever had a fermented dairy product, you had an organic acid that was fermented by the bacteria that help preserve that food, or a fermented meat, or a fermented vegetable like sauerkraut, kimchi, those sorts of things. Organic acids are really good at preserving foods. And in the US today, we can use them in a lot of other foods, not just fermented ones, to control the acidity of the food and control microbial growth and shelf life, product quality, and product safety. These are some of the major types of organic acids that are often used in the food industry. Many of these have some natural source to them, and then we can also synthesize them to make them cheaper to use and just as effective as the natural ones. And acetic acid, for example, I'll show you just acetic acid. That's the key agent in vinegar. So again, some of these are very natural in terms of their sources, and others, again, we can have natural and synthetic sources. Citric acid, oranges, lemons, limes, that's the acid in lemons. That's what makes our mouth kind of tart up a lot. If you're a consumer of things like cured meats, like cured sausages, like salamis, pepperonis, hot dogs, things like that, nitrates and nitrites are a very significant mechanism by which we protect the safety of those types of cured meat type products. Cured meats, the curing agents, the nitrate, the nitrite, they don't only give us good flavor and color, they actually help us prevent botulism in our foods. And so there's a big reason why we use them in a variety of cured products in the US, but we have to be very careful about how we use them so that we don't exceed safe levels of these chemical agents. Sulfites are often used in wines, other types of trail mix products, fruits and vegetables, things such as that. And then I want to talk some about further processing in terms of physical processing. Everybody probably has a refrigerator at home. The purpose of the refrigerator is to keep foods cold. We know that. And it does so by keeping cold, it slows down microbial growth. But refrigeration, if you think about commercial refrigeration, is limited to some degree by how much we can put in it and what its cooling capacity is. Refrigerators that have blast air, high-speed moving air, tend to work better at cooling foods quickly, but we need them in order to make sure that things are kept safe. We need refrigeration systems. I give you these are recommendations by the USDA for refrigerated shelf life or frozen shelf life on a variety of meat and poultry type products. And you can see refrigeration helps us, but freezing obviously extends that shelf life a lot longer besides just the initial refrigeration. The same is true even for hearted dry sausages, frankfurters, other types of luncheon meats, deli meats, semi-dry sausages like a summer sausage or a Lebanon sausage. All of these can get long shelf lives, much, much longer than not having a refrigerator by using one, and then even longer with a freezer. I want to move on to freezing. Freezing in tandem with refrigeration, or if you have a freezing capacity, you can get a lot of shelf life out of frozen products. That that table I showed just a couple moments ago was talking about, hey, frozen shelf life, 1 to 2 months. I'll be honest with you, I don't know about you, but I have some frozen meats in my chest freezer that are a lot older than 2 months. And I'm not worried about them because I'm going to pull them out, I'm going to fully thaw them, and then I'm going to fully cook them to make sure that they're perfectly safe to consume by myself and my family. But freezing is just a much, much more severe form of low temperature storage. It freezes all the water into ice, and that prevents microbial growth even more effectively than does refrigeration. Probably from a commercial standpoint, and maybe even from your own standpoint and just being in your home, the most significant form of processing we have is that of cooking. And that's really what we say. When we say thermal processing, what we really mean is we're cooking. And there are a few definitions here. Most US commercially made foods, those that are cooked, are either pasteurized, which renders them safe, but doesn't typically make them shelf stable. Others are considered commercially sterile. That means they're not only safe, but they're also shelf stable. But a commercially sterile food is not an actually sterile food. There are still viable microbes that are living in your commercially sterile food, like your canned products, like canned meats, canned produce, and all the other foods that you might buy on the shelf. It's just that they're in a condition, they're in an environment where they cannot use the nutrients in the food. They can't grow at that temperature of ambient storage, shelf storage. So they're not going to cause you any harm. All right. Cooking of foods, these are given to us by the FDA. These are minimum safe cook temperatures for a variety of fresh and further processed meat and poultry products. These are fully accessible via the FDA. The food code is a document that if you need a mechanism to get yourself to sleep, read the food code. It is very, very interesting reading if you're interested in this. But if you can't hit the sack and doze off, put the food code on and just start reading it. I promise you it'll take about 3 pages and you're out like a light. The last major thing I want to talk about is just to let you know about how in the food industry, as well as in your home or a small food processing establishment, we help to keep pathogens out. And that's through cleaning and sanitizing. Cleaning is we get things clean, just as you might guess. Sanitizing is we treat an already cleaned surface to kill any microbes that might still be living on that surface. So now think about the equipment you might use to prepare a food or cook a food or refrigerate a food or handle a food, not the food itself. I want the surfaces that touch that food to be just as clean and sanitary as the food itself. This graphic also comes to us from the Produce Safety Alliance. And what it does is it just kind of demonstrates the 4 major steps. I clean my food easily. Loose foods, I just push them off. I put on my detergent. I scrub it in. I do what my dad says. I put a little elbow grease on it. I rinse off the detergent because you want clean food surfaces, but you don't want to eat soap. So we always rinse our detergent off so that there's no residue of the soap in our food. And then the last thing we do is we spray our sanitizer. And that little green thing that you see dying that kind of looks like, turf grass, those are the bacteria. The sanitizer kills those organisms. So now we have a clean and sanitary surface in order to make our food products with. I give you this. These are some recommendations, some best practice recommendations from Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. These are some things that you can do if you need to make sanitizers in your home for making small scale batches of food that you're giving away to friends and family, or you might want to sell, say at a farmer's market or at a community event, something like this. These are some easy, cheaply made sanitizers that are very effective. And here's how long the shelf life of the sanitizer is. This column here, this is the shelf life of the sanitizer, not the food. Household bleach, this is how you'd formulate it. Let it sit for about a minute, and then every week make a new bottle of this working solution because it actually does go bad after about a week. Hydrogen peroxide, go buy it from your drugstore. You don't really even want to dilute it, but just follow the manufacturer's expiration date on the bottle of hydrogen peroxide. You can go buy ethyl alcohol. You'd have to go to a liquor store in Texas or something of that nature and buy 95% or 190 proof alcohol and dilute it down to about 70%. Too high of an alcohol content, it'll evaporate off and it won't do any good. Too low a content, it won't do any good. So you kind of have to hit that sweet spot of about 65 to 70%. You dilute it in water. You let it sit for about 10 minutes, let it evaporate off, maybe spray it a couple more times using a spray bottle. That bottle of 70% alcohol will be useful to you for about 4 months. So about 3 times a year, you'd have to make some new alcohol sanitizer. Ethyl alcohol is safe to consume in very, very minimal amounts. I am not recommending that you do consume it for this purpose, but even this, if a residue got into a food, it wouldn't harm anyone. The other good thing about an ethyl alcohol is that along with the hydrogen peroxide, it will effectively evaporate off if you just let it sit there. And so there won't be any residue in your food. And so you don't have to worry about your children or friends or family who are non-alcohol consumers getting even a residue of it. The bleach, on the other hand, will not evaporate very quickly. And I would recommend you get a paper towel or a wet towel and wipe it off after you've allowed it to work so that you get any residue off of that surface. The last thing I'll talk about is something called sanitary design. This is something that if you're thinking about going into the food industry or starting a food startup company, this is something to think about as you begin to kind of look at where you might make a food product. How do you think about doing things even in a small scale environment that you might build in your home, such as an outdoor shed or facility next to your home that you might want to make food in? The things to keep in mind is that the idea of sanitary design is to locate and use equipment that can be easily cleaned and sanitized. Build an environment that you can clean and sanitize. The more effectively you can do that, the better you are going to be at keeping safe, high quality food. And then lastly, these things called SOPs. We use these things in the industry all the time. If any of you are thinking about starting an in-home food business that you think could grow, or you want to work with somebody else, maybe a spouse, a neighbor, some high school kid down the street that you want to give some part-time employment to, these kinds of documents help you to develop a mechanism by which you're going to train the people you work with and who work under you to know how to do a task specifically, repeatedly, consistently, every time they're doing that task the exact same way once you train them on how to do it. And with that, I'll say thank you for listening. And if you've got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I think we got about just a few minutes. If anyone's got any questions about anything, I'm happy to try and give you the best answer I can.
And I will say, while we're giving folks a minute to put in some questions, in addition to this presentation being on the Farmer Veteran Coalition YouTube channel, we'll also have a PDF version on the AgriLogic Consulting website under training, because I know there's a lot of great information. If you need to go check that out some more, it will be there.
Yep, no doubt. How about honey? Great question. Honey is one of those really kind of interesting foods that if it gets cross-contaminated, organisms can survive in it. They won't replicate very well because there's actually a massive amount of sugar in honey, and there's actually so much sugar that it reduces the water activity sufficiently to keep them from growing. But it's about getting the honey out safely. One of the recommendations I make specific to honey in my students in my classes is to never ever feed honey to very young children. Newborns to anywhere up to 2 years old, they should never eat raw honey. And that's because of how we harvest honey and the potential for botulism to occur in those infants. Because while the honey doesn't support the growth of the pathogenic organism, even a small number of those organisms in an infant's gut can be outrageously problematic. I mean, almost a guarantee of fatality. We don't see it much in the US anymore, but we do still see cases popping up. And so honey is one of those things that unless you've sort of developed a gut microbiome that can kind of tolerate it and deal with it, toddler age and beyond, don't feed your very young children fresh raw honey. If you can get pasteurized, that helps. But I don't ever see a whole lot of pasteurized honey in the grocery store. You could about say the same for maple syrup, especially real maple syrup. It's about the same kind of issue. But where we've seen most of the instances is in honey of foodborne disease. Great question.
All right. Not seeing anything else. This is really great, Dr. Taylor. We really appreciate you giving us all this information. Very well presented.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the invite. And thanks everyone for your attendance and listening in today. I appreciate it. I hope I didn't gross anyone out too much. I kind of do enjoy doing that with my students, but I do want you to make sure that, you take away some good safety information. My email address, if anybody wants it, to ask any further questions is Matt, M-A-T-T, Taylor, Taylor, at ag.tamu, TAMU.edu.
All right, thank you for that, Matthew. And again, for everyone, it's being recorded, be on our YouTube channel for the next week or so. And then for anyone who wants the presentation, please reach out to me. I'll put my email in the group, the chat. I can email you the presentation, and yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation. Thank you again, Matthew, for the great presentation. It was very informative and something that
Thank you.
a lot of our members would appreciate. And
I
then,
appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
yep, and then we'll be back again on July 2nd for another webinar. So be on the lookout for that. But other than that, though,
Great.
take care, everyone, and y'all have a great day.
Adios. Gig 'em.